Dr. Joanne Butrin, author of the book From the Roots Up, taking a closer look at compassion and justice in missions. I'm so glad that you're going to be having a look at my book, and I hope that it will have some meaning to you. One of the reasons that I decided to write this book is that my position at Assemblies of God World Missions has me traveling around the world. I am often asked to look at, to view, to participate in compassion-related projects. I have at sometimes been asked to do an evaluation of them. And I find that our missionaries are doing wonderful work. They are reaching out, trying to meet the needs of the people around them. But many of them have had no formal training in what would be considered best practice in missions, particularly in compassion missions. I find that a lot of people don't even plan to do compassion ministry when they go to the field to be a missionary, and yet, as they're surrounded by need, they find it they just have to respond, and so not having any actual training or any idea what is considered best practice, people just sometimes jump in and do the best that they can do. But what often happens with that is it's a missionary-driven, missionary-funded, missionary-supported project or program or ministry, and oftentimes the local church, the local community is not involved, and therefore they have very little ownership of the project or the idea. And so then when the missionary leaves or the funds run out or something like that happens, since sustainability locally hasn't been a part of it, then the project either comes to a halt or is handed over to a church or a group of people who really don't have a heart for it, don't have the money for it, and things just kind of disintegrate from there sometimes. So in an effort to provide some kind of benchmark, some kind of training, and some kind of look at best practice in compassion and justice issues, I decided, since I teach this a lot, to just put it into this book, From the Roots Up. And I also have had field experience doing this kind of work, compassion ministries. I started my missionary career in Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, and it's a very, very remote area where I worked. I was assigned to run a hospital and a clinic and do outpatient work, and I was very ill prepared myself. I was a nurse, they needed a doctor. And suddenly I found myself, wow, I don't speak the language, I don't have proper training, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I began to study and to try to learn, and we didn't have Google, we didn't have internet in those days. So I was on my own. There were a lot of old textbooks from previous nurses that had been out there, and so I just began to study. So I kind of did all my study backwards, went back to school, and I got home, learned a whole bunch more about tropical medicine and lab and all kinds of things, and got better prepared for what God wanted me to do. But somewhere along the way, as I was back in the States, I ended up going to a course at Wheaton College, which was at that time called primary health care. Now it would be called community health care or community development, really. And I was, for the first time, exposed to the idea of not treating symptoms, but actually doing preventative work and actually mobilizing people and communities and churches to figure out their own solutions and help take care for themselves. So that's kind of how my journey on the community development, community health, and this book began. A chapter, beginning chapter of my book, because I think it kind of sets the stage for the kinds of things that we do without even realizing that it's not best practice. When I was located out in the jungle there in Congo, as I was writing back home and sharing needs, I mentioned about the lepers that we were caring for in the country at that time, the lepers were isolated into their own villages because everyone was afraid of them and didn't want them integrated into the main society. So myself and my coworker would go to the leper village and we would care for the wounds and things. And I was writing home to some of our women's groups about them because they like to send bandages that they would roll out of sheets. I know it sounds crazy, but the lepers really liked them because they could reuse them and wash them. So anyway, some of the ladies groups thought it would be wonderful to send some used clothing to these poor lepers who really did not have much. And so they did a clothing drive, used clothing. They packed up some 55-gallon drums and they sent them. And those drums took over a year and a half to get there. They went by boat, by ship, by boat, then by train and riverboat and truck. And after all of that, and I can't imagine how many thousands of dollars, they finally arrived in our little mission station. And so we set up a day for the lepers to come, and we had sorted everything out so that everybody could get a shirt or a pair of pants or both, and the women could get a blouse and a skirt. And the clothing were not particularly appropriate for the 100-degree jungle living that we did, but nonetheless, we just thought everyone would be so thrilled to get them. So we had everybody come up one by one and get their clothing. We handed it to them. They said thank you, and then they left. And but I noticed they didn't go away. They were standing around kind of talking with each other. And so when we were finally done, I just wished them a good day and said, I'll see you. And one man who was evidently chosen as the spokesperson came up on the porch and said, in a rather angry, frustrated voice, he said, ma'am, he said, look, I have these pants, I have a shirt, but where's the belt? And where are the socks? He said, this is not a complete outfit. Well, needless to say, I was quite startled and a little bit upset, and if I was able to say in the language we spoke, you've got to be kidding, I probably would have said something like that. But I did say, well, I'm surprised you're not more grateful. These came all the way from the States. Well, I could see that there was something wrong, and it wasn't until a lot later when I really realized some of the mistakes I had made in that whole situation. First of all, though I went to the leper village and I preached in their little church and I prayed with them and I cared for their wounds, I don't remember ever sitting down and just saying, how are you doing? How do you feel about being isolated in this community? What are some of the good things happening in your life? What are some of the not so great things? And if any help could be had, what would you need or want? Well, I think had I had that conversation, and don't ask me why I didn't, but if I had, I don't think used clothing from America probably would have made the priority list. I think rather they would have been saying things like maybe some farm implements that had special handles on them. Most of these people were missing fingers, limbs, hands, feet, and they had a really hard time with their gardening, and yet they were dependent on crops for them to be able to live. And so I think some special farm instruments that could be strapped to their arms or something would have been something. I think if they could say what they really needed to, it would be help going out and chopping down the limbs that they needed to rebuild their houses, because they had to replace their mud homes about every 2 or 3 years. And it was so difficult for them to chop down the limbs and to drag them back. And I think those practical kinds of help would have been far more on the priority list when I think of all the thousands of dollars that went into those clothes that really probably could have helped them manage in a much better way and have a better quality of life. So I think what they were really saying to me was not so much about the belt and the socks as, why didn't you ask us? What would really help us? Well, I made a lot of mistakes in those early days, but hopefully we all learn from our mistakes and we go forward. In my book, I talk about what holistic ministry really is all about. I have an entire chapter entitled, What Do People Really Need and Want, and How Do We Find That Out? We talk about doing assessments, community assessments together. We direct you to some tools that you can actually use to find out what is in their hand already. What are some of the great resources they already have? And then what are some of the needs that are present? And then how could those needs be solved together? A lot of how we view and define poverty has to do with how we practice compassion. If we see poverty completely from a deficit point of view, then we're always going to be trying to make up that deficit. We're always going to be trying to give and fill in. And yet, fact is, no matter how much money we have, how much effort and resource we have, we're never going to be able to make up material deficit. I think that Bryant Myers in his book, Walking with the Poor, says that really poverty is more about relationships that have gone awry. And Brian Fickard and Steve Corbett in their book, When Helping Hurts, talk about poverty as related more to being out of harmony with God, with ourselves, with others, with our surroundings. And so there are lots of different ways to look at poverty, but I think if we think only of material deficit, then we're always going to be trying to just meet that deficit need, and we really won't be able to. I also talk about the critical importance of the church. I don't think that we as missionaries should do anything without the church being a partner with us. Everything we do should be in, through, and with the local church, if there is one. And if they don't have a vision for reaching out, then I think a huge part of our role could be teaching, speaking, training, and casting vision, and also finding out what their vision is and coming alongside and helping to support theirs as well. So the local church. And if there isn't a local church, if you're going to a place where there really isn't a local church, then we think about the future church. We think about the community that we've targeted to work with as the future church, and doing compassion with that community often will help us develop relationships that will later lead to an opportunity to present Jesus. When we think of holistic ministry, no matter how we get there, proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ is part of the holistic ministry. It is an essential part. Because for all of us, at the heart of everything that we do and think and pray, it's the lostness of people. And so at the heart of every ministry that we have, every holistic approach that we take is going to include the spiritual component of people's lives, and it is going to include proclamation. It must. That's who we are. That's what we're about. We want to see people come to a relationship with Jesus. It may take a while for us to be able to do that proclaiming, because we may be in a situation where we would absolutely be kicked out if we were openly proclaiming. But you know what I find is, as we build relationship, people notice that there's something different about us, and they want to know why. And as they ask the question, we're able to share about the good news of Jesus Christ. And I go on to talk about transformational development, and what does that really mean, that entire communities can be transformed as Jesus comes on the scene and as we are working to improve the quality of life of people. We talk about justice, and how do we find justice? That's a buzzword today, but justice really is all about systems and structures, and if everything were as God intended, there would be no injustice, but we know that's not true. So social justice has to do with the systems and structures that have gone awry and allow for corruption and trafficking and exploitation, and really are contributing to poverty and marginalization. There's just so much that happens from a macro level. And so usually when we're doing compassion work, we're working on the effects of social injustice, not social injustice itself. because we have to be very careful about our political stance in any given place. And so then we go on to talk about donor dilemmas, how we avoid donor-driven practice and yet how we incorporate donors, because we need them, into our work. Then we look at assessment and evaluation and sustainability. That is just such a huge part of any compassion ministry. When we start from day one, we have to be thinking about evaluation, what our objectives are, and how we're going to look at sustainability. If we're inputting funds in the beginning, how is that going to be withdrawn over time, and who? And we have to think about ownership being locally owned and driven. So I hope that you'll find my book, From the Roots Up, helpful as you begin your journey in missions or ministry or whatever you're doing. The principles that are in this book actually apply, I believe, to any kind of ministry we're doing, whether it's church planting, Bible school training, evangelism. It's just all basic best practice principles of mission. So I hope it's a blessing to you. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email at jbutrin@eg.org. God bless you.